All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. My friend Joe and I, we're doing an experiment here. We are going to be talking, we're going to take topics which require very little effort to present and put down on the table, but which generate a lot of interactive interest. Now, the good thing is that we've done more than 400 meetups. So we know the topics. I don't know how, but Joe has attended more of my meetups than I have. But both of us know what is it that most of us are interested in. So we'll pick some topic like that where there is a tremendous familiarity. We will give some kind of a reference, which is very short, so people can read up or watch a quick video and be on, up to speed. Or we might choose something that we have looked at in the past. And we will start off by giving very short introduction to the topic, and then invite each of you to talk about what did you get from that topic. And then we will build that up into the breakout rooms, and then we're going to do the lightning round, okay? And the aim here is that we want to invite anybody who wants to join in this process at whatever level. Okay, so this is an experiment to see how much interactivity can be achieved with minimum effort. So that's what we are trying to do. And today we're going to be talking about systems thinking. So Joe is going to start with some comments, and then I'm going to call upon anybody else who wants to talk about their thoughts on systems thinking or Russell Ackoff. You will have between 2 to 5 minutes to put your thoughts on the table. And then we're going to do breakout rooms. And when we come back, you come back with the biggest question you have on systems thinking. We'll collect all the questions, and then we're going to do lightning round of answers from everybody. Okay, so that's the format. So Joe, go ahead.
And thank you, everybody, for joining me this evening. We will be discussing, as Srikant had already mentioned, systems thinking, but we will be focusing on Russell Ackoff, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And we'll just talk about why systems thinking is important, and then we'll discuss a little bit about the practical examples that he provides us with and how to think a little bit differently. So why I thought systems thinking would even be a good discussion topic is because there are many times that we're seeking the right answer to a specific problem. And in this process, we often don't really necessarily understand what is the underlying problem. And we get an answer, we're happy, and we move on. And one of the examples one of the best sayings that I thought Russell Ackoff had was in his video was by Peter Drucker. He said, there's a big difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. And that's a really important distinction to make, because many times we're very largely devoted to doing the wrong thing right. And we really have to analyze why a problem has to exist in the first place. And the few examples I hope that we walk through really will highlight the importance of not only questioning the problem in front of you, but also thinking about how the system itself how multiple parts within a system interact. So one of the most interesting things I think I find about systems thinking is that it helps you ask better questions without jumping to conclusions about a problem. Now, I have read about a couple of different systems thinkers at this point, Bucky Fuller, Russell Ackoff, and Jay Forrester. And there is one thing I would like to highlight, is that they do focus on the idea of specialization and how we look at problems. And problems are often linear from our perspective when you have a hyper specialization. And somebody brings us a problem, we just solve it. We don't necessarily think about all the other parts that surround the problem. And this leads me to one of Ackoff's most important points, which is problems are not disciplinary in nature, but are often holistic. So one of the really interesting examples he provides in the video that was posted was an elevator in New York City. There was in a post-World War II building that had a problem where the tenants were complaining at how long it was taking to get up and down the elevator. Where they were waiting for the elevator approximately 2 minutes, when normally an American standard for elevators is 20 seconds, which seems a little bit excessive for me, but people were complaining and people were threatening to move out of this building, and they would have lost rent and it would have been problematic. So management brought in a team of specialists and engineers. And these engineers looked at it and they said, well, you have three options. You can add elevators, you can automate your elevators, or you can change your computer controls. And they said, we'll have to do a little bit of analysis, but we'll let you know which one's the best option. So they paid the firm $2 million to do an analysis on the building. And they come back and they say, none of these options are really going to work well for you. Because if you add more elevators, that you'll lose rental income. And if you automate the elevators, you'll only see a minor gain in performance. If you computerize the controls, again, you're only going to see minor gains in the performance of the elevators. So that the management company was so distraught about this problem, because they thought they were going to lose tenants, and they were trying to figure out what to do. They held a brainstorming session with a lot of subordinates with the management company. And what had happened was that someone came up with the idea of simply putting mirrors in the lobby, because the person was saying that essentially the problem was not with the elevators or how long people were waiting. The problem was with people were bored. They were impatient. They needed to be distracted. And if you think about this logically, if you're waiting 2 minutes for an elevator, that makes sense. But if you only looked at it from an engineering perspective, if you only took that narrow view, you would have had to spend a lot of money and time and effort. And you wouldn't even have been really solving the underlying issue that was really bothering everybody. It was just that they were bored, not that they needed to get somewhere a lot faster. So I think that this is a really good example, because it shows that the problems aren't always what they seem. And what I would, when I think of systems thinking, it really is, it's a good example, because it's how parts of a system interact with each other, how the customer actually interacts with the elevator. And you actually looked at the customer, not just the elevator itself, to come to a solution. And that's what systems thinking is. It takes different parts and analyzes how they interact with one another. So what does systems thinking do that I really like? I think it looks at culture, how culture influences behavior, how technology influences an organization, how your goals impact your actions. So these three things are that's a high level overview. But this is really important to understand a couple of the other examples that we'll go through that Ackoff provided. The one I really, really liked was the one where he used as a way to improve literacy rates. And what he did was, there was a school district that was failing miserably, with a number of individuals were illiterate, essentially, and they needed to improve the rates for the school district. And what the first thing they did was they looked at the kids themselves and said, these kids are very, very smart. So that's not a problem. Then they looked at their homes, and 65% of them didn't have books in their homes. So the way they were communicating is mostly orally. So they had to figure out how to influence these kids and motivate these kids in order to learn. So the distinction here is really important, because if you just use it from the basic school model, you would bring in a specialist and say, how do you teach these kids to read? What do you need to, what do they need? What resources do they need? Well, they came up with an experiment where they played silent films of Charlie Chaplin in the cafeteria. And without question, each student could actually go leave and watch those films at any point in the day. And by the end of the semester, everybody in that school could read at the proper grade level. Now, why is that important? Because I think that if you didn't look at the way the cultural aspect of this, how kids were interacting outside of school, not just inside of school, then you would have never gotten to your answer. And this is what systems thinking is all about. It's about looking at the whole problem, not just looking at a problem within a specific context from your perspective. Another example that that I've used in other meetups that I actually think is excellent is the one where they took a group of students that were coming in from the National Science Foundation. They were given a grant, and they were given real world problems, and they had to learn differential equations essentially in order to solve the problems that they've been hired to solve. When they brought these kids in, they said, all right, well, are you going to teach us differential equations? They said, absolutely not. They said, there are the books, you can figure it out, and you can come back and you can ask me any question you want, but I'm not going to teach you. Well, not only did they solve all the problems that they were assigned for their summer project, but they also tested out of the first 2 years at Case Western University's mathematics department. Now, why is that important? There's something similar here between these two stories. There's motivation. You have to be motivated to do, and in order to accomplish your whatever goal you're setting for someone else, they have to be motivated to do it. But the important part was they couldn't just look at it from a very linear perspective as that I'm going to teach you how to do this and you're going to learn, and this is the way it's going to work. If they had looked at that from those perspectives, it would have failed miserably. So in kind of closing, the idea here is the reason systems thinking is interesting to me is that it provides you with tools that essentially can really change the outcomes of seemingly dire situations. They provide you with a way of questioning exactly the problem that you're trying to solve, as opposed to just trying to solve a problem in and of itself. And I think that that's a very powerful skill to have. I witnessed this personally when I was in consulting and in work. You have to, even when you go into an organization, you can have solutions, but if the culture is not really, if the corporate culture is really not willing to accept the solution, you can have the best solution in the world, it won't work. You have to adapt to your environment. And then that is really, you have to take everything into account, the whole, as we would say, as many systems thinkers would say. So that's pretty much my just overview of systems thinking, why it can be exciting. Now, there are some thoughts that counter systems thinking that don't feel like it's as effective as, as I'm making it out to be. But I found it to be an incredibly powerful tool to begin to question things and to really think outside of the linear process of a problem that I'm usually being given at work. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. I just want to add to that example of literacy. So the thing about the silent movies, the reason it worked is that the silent movies had subtitles, and people read. I mean, those if you're familiar with Charlie Chaplin, he's a genius, and it's just amazing what he manages to do. And everybody wanted to know what the subtitles were saying, and then they found out that once they wanted to read, they had all the tools and they pretty much could do that themselves. So it's a question of why, instead of kind of focusing on just how, focusing on why. So once they had a why, they had plenty of hows that they had in their back pocket that they could use. All right, wonderful. So thank you, Joe. That was great overview. So folks, as I was saying, this is interactive. So please, I would love to hear what you got from the video. What do you think of systems thinking? I encourage everybody to share. So go ahead and type ! in chat if you would like to talk about your take on this, on Russell Ackoff, that video, or systems thinking in general. So the rules remain the same. Type ! in chat or raise your hand in Zoom to speak. Keep on topic, be brief. This time you can take between 2 minutes to 5 minutes, as long as you keep on topic. And then feel free to disagree with anybody on anything. Speak your mind, and but be courteous. All right, who'd like to go first? Laura, what do you think about this video or Russell Ackoff?
I'm very impressed with the idea of looking at the whole, but then looking at the parts that make up the whole. And I like the idea that Joe was talking about also. I really think it's important. I think, when you look at the whole and just accept the whole, you're really missing out on a lot of it because you're not understanding what makes up the whole. And you have to look at all the parts. You really do. As small as they may seem, that can be that little that little cog that makes it all work, and you can't ignore that part either. And I like the idea here too of all what Joe was talking about. Yeah, maybe you have the mirror so the people look at themselves for 2 minutes and admire themselves, and they don't even think of the time they could have spent 10 more minutes looking at themselves and not cared. I live in a building where I think it's the slowest elevator that exists in the city of Brooklyn. I mean, it's just unbearably slow, and it's only 6 stories high. And sure, there's nothing to look at. And, so it's really boring to wait for it. And, you can't imagine that could, I'm sure if there was a mirror there, the time would go faster for me too. And I don't even care to look at myself in the mirror. So, but it would be better than nothing. And, in each one of those examples. And I think, it awoke in me too. And I do think of the parts, but it was really, it clarified something for me too, because I don't even know if I look at the parts of the whole for the goals, my problems. I think about the whole thing all at once, and you can't do that. There's many parts to it. And it's given me a new awakening to go back and think of the parts of the whole that I have to look at. And I like looking at that. And I hope as we go on and look at some of the problems we look at, that we take a step back each time and look at the pieces of the whole that we're talking about too. So I'm excited about doing more systems thinking.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay.
Folks, go ahead and line up for talking about your comments by typing ! Next up is Maritza.
I had managed to not attend any of your previous videos on systems thinking. And so I kind of fully immersed myself. I just jumped right in for the last 2 days. And I've watched several of Ackoff's lectures now. And I knew I was going to keep watching them. After, at the very beginning of, I don't even remember which lecture I saw of his, he provided a separate definition for knowledge and understanding. And I fell in love right there, because that's something I often say. And I often, when I find myself in a discussion that's sliding perhaps into a disagreement, I like to separate those two terminologies, because to know something is not the same as to understand. And I've always felt this to be true. So I was just delighted to see somebody, you know, with renowned and chops saying the same thing. And what he's saying to us, he says, you know, knowledge is contained in the how-to question, and understanding is contained in the explanations to the why. But then, even better, he throws in wisdom, and he says that wisdom makes the transition between efficiency and effectiveness. And that, to me, is the enticing aspect of the systems thinking. And in the examples that Joe gave us, he's showing us that transition. In each one of those stories that sounds like this ridiculous impossibility, that minute on a pin switch is an out-of-the-box thinker who didn't actually know what everyone else thought the problem should be, but they understood a different aspect that was being presented. And what I'm hearing in what's being presented here and the basics of system thinking is that it's a cautionary tale to constantly be shifting in our viewing of a situation. And it makes me think of when you're learning kickboxing. I'm terrible at it, by the way. But when you're trying to do this, they teach you land on your feet, right? And you have to do that little where you feel weird because you're doing a little hop around dance. But the premise is that the lighter you stay on your feet, the faster and easier it is for you to pivot. And that's what I'm hearing is the layman's version of what's being said here about systems thinking. And there's a quote that I just love that he said. Actually, I don't know that it was his quote. I think he's quoting somebody else, and I don't remember who, but he says, a problem is to reality what an atom is to a table. And he says, what you experience are tables, not atoms, the whole, not the parts. And the way, in my mind, that matches with the concept of, knowing something versus understanding it and changing your perspective so you can pivot, is that just because we aren't in the forefront of our mind thinking of a table as an atom, it does not take away the fact that the table is still made up of many atoms. And should something change somehow that structure, it would affect the table, even without us being consciously aware of it. So I just really was very intrigued and impressed with these, and I look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is going to be Jade, Jane, and Madeline. Jade.
I think this is interesting. I didn't realize Joe was presenting, so kudos to Joe. I think this is a large part of what I'm always saying, but what about everything else? I'm the bane of everyone's existence, and the Jordan Petersons, because I'm but what about what he's not saying? To me, this is a question of the forest and the trees. And even when we go the forest and the trees, guess what? Something's missing, the roots. There's so many things that are not being paid attention to when we just look at the forest and the trees. And I could go on ad nauseum to explain all the things, but let's just use the roots. When people go too deep, we have people who love to go deep, and we have people who are very superficial. The fruit is just as important as the root sometimes, and it depends on what you're looking at. Ginger, you want the root. An apple tree, you want the apple. That's superficial. It's up top. You're going to see that quick. But if you didn't have people who dug in the ground, we wouldn't have our ginger tea. So, and you know, that's all like metaphorical, whatever imagery. But I think people get the concept that I'm trying to give. It's like you have to know where to look, what you're looking for. And usually what we're looking for is where, if there's an issue, the solution is usually where we haven't looked. You know, everyone's lost their keys or something. They're where you haven't looked. If you knew, like, you'd have your keys and things would go well if you looked where you were supposed to look. But I think the thing about systems thinking that I appreciate is that it's willingness to identify variables and nuance. Because I think that's also a big part of why we don't solve things, is because we think this is how it is and that's all it is, or we decide what matters and what doesn't matter. And that's always hard to tell unless you pull something out. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, but I think it's worth thinking about the things we tend not to think about. That's usually how we solve problems.
That's fantastic, Jade. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Jane, followed by Madeline. Folks, if you want to give your takeaways, please go ahead. And type exclamation mark.
All right. So this is not what I really intended to say, but Jade stimulated me. One time I misplaced my keys and I thought to myself, where is the least likely place for them to be? And my answer was the refrigerator. And that's where they were. But now I'll get to what I wanted to talk about. I think that systems thinking may be incompatible with the scientific method, because the scientific method, as I know it, is that one is taught to develop a null hypothesis, which one is encouraged to prove or disprove. So I think that narrows the scope considerably. And I have such respect for the scientific method, as well as newfound respect for systems thinking. So I'm having trouble integrating those.
Thank you, Jane. Great question, and hopefully we'll come back to it. What we're going to do is that, after the breakout rooms, we will have a chance of posing a question. So Jane, could you pose this question again after the breakout rooms? Because I would like to see different people's. You would love to hear everybody's answers to this question. Thank you. Next up is going to be Madeline, Kevin, and Andrew. Madeline.
Yes, hi. Joe, thank you. That was a terrific presentation.
Thank you.
A few things stood out. I had watched the Ackoff video. One is motivation, which is that motivation to learn and how systems thinking works with that. For example, watching the Charlie Chaplin films and wanting to learn to read because they wanted to learn the subtitles, or the students doing calculus. The other thing that stood out to me, which I realize in the interest of time, you couldn't get to everything in this, was when Ackoff talked about that the whole often works best when none of the parts are working optimally. In other words, if you fix a part, you keep fixing each part so that it's functioning perfectly, the whole thing may be off. And it reminds me of a very long time ago, someone I worked for paid for me to go to piano tuning school, which made no sense because I don't play piano. But nonetheless, one of the things that I learned was that you couldn't just use a piano tuning note machine and match everything, because the scale we use, it's called the tempered scale. It has to do with the math of octaves. Everything has to be slightly off in order for the piano to sound right. And that's why it requires the human ear. You start with the A, you go up by octaves, you have to adjust within the octaves by listening to the harmonics, the way the waves work together. And that reminds me of this, which is that it made more sense in a way that we live in such an imperfect world. I don't know if the whole is functioning according to my standards, but at least, you know, I think that the trying to fix every part does throw things out of sync. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Madeline. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Andrew. Kevin.
Thank you, Sanka and Jose and everyone else. I hear you guys all good. My take is related to our 52 living idea. The system thinking is related to our system 2. We mentioned an induction and integration, construction, comprehensive, wholeness, and plus oneness. If it's comparable, it's we normally educated linear thinking. Our knowledge is deductive by disciplinary, subject by subject, more micro. We need another round back to our original. Let's say put everything together. It's like one tree. Jade said we could look for the problem. Look ginger from a root. If we look for something from apple, but apple still need a root grow. That's second. It's I would say it's, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Like Madeline said, you fix all the parts, it didn't put it together until you like let's say formal follow the functions. You from the system structure level look at as whole, then everything come as beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate that. Next up is Jyoti. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, applying the same principle in the classroom situation between with the children who have behavior problems. The teacher is looking at the behavior and she's flowering up his behavior, and she's trying to tell the parents in so many words, some really flowery words, how his behavior is impacting his learning. And she has no idea where the behavior is stemming from. So going back to his patterns and trying to find out how and where this behavior stemmed from is the solution to his behavior. So that's what makes me think about this system 1 in practical way. I don't know if I'm right in thinking this way or.
Sure.
No.
What we'll do is go ahead, Joe.
No, absolutely. I mean, and this is actually holds true even in corporate cultures and how you introduce something. You have to understand, like the military culture would be very different than say another like Goldman Sachs or a Google. Just the way they are functioning, and they're different in their cultural basis, that you would have solutions would look very different for each one. But you're right. You know, looking at how the culture and behavior link together is critical in systems thinking. And that's one of the things that I like the best about it, is that it doesn't stop at just asking the question as to why the kids aren't reading in the first place.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I want to add just one comment. I really liked what Jade said about this is kind of, you know, basically paying attention to what is it that you're not seeing. Okay, there is a great concept that Marshall McLuhan has, which is based on Gestalt psychology, is the distinction between figure and ground. Figure is what you're aware of, what is there in your consciousness, what you're looking at. But there is the ground. Ground is basically everything that is around it, the context that gives rise to it. And you can't really understand the figure without the ground. And ground is always in the background. It is the supporting thing. It is very complex. Sometimes, like many times, the ground is automatized. It is implicit. But that is what is there that is shaping whatever it is that you're looking at. So if you're just working with the figure, you will actually never see the problem. One of my favorite things about favorite quote from him is that, you don't solve the problem, you dissolve the problem. So you have to kind of change the parameters because you're usually operating with very artificial limits. So this figure ground distinction I find very, very powerful. All right, folks. So what we're going to do is we are going to go into breakout rooms and we're going to ask ourselves just one question. And that is, Joe, you want to specify the question number 3?
Yeah. Can you think of a problem that would be well served by taking a systems thinking approach? So it's a little bit of a.
Go ahead.
So it's a little bit of a brainstorming exercise.
Exactly. So what we want to say is that we've been talking about systems thinking approach. So think of a problem which could use it. Joe talked about a few examples from Ackoff. Think of your own example. Come up with examples and let's discuss it for about 20 minutes. And then when we come back, ask the greatest question you have on systems thinking, the biggest question on your mind. I'll collect all the questions and then we are going to do a rapid round of answers from everybody about it, the lightning round. All right, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. We'll be back here again in 20 minutes. The rules in the breakout rooms is that let everybody speak for a couple of minutes about their answer to the question, what problem they would like to apply systems thinking to, and then we'll have a discussion. Keep on topic, be brief, feel free to disagree, but do so courteously. Starting the breakout rooms now. Hi, folks. Welcome back, folks. All right, so it's time for questions, the big questions. So go ahead and so what we're going to do is that we're going to talk about the biggest question on our mind about systems theory. And go ahead and type a exclamation mark in chat to share your question. So I'm going to collect all the questions and then we're going to do a lightning round of answers to the questions. So who would like to go first? Go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. Oh, just a second. Kevin.
Oh, my question would be, what's the system in system thinking? What's your definition?
Okay, what is the definition of system?
Yeah,
Okay.
in system thinking.
Very good. All right, who'd like to go next? So at this point, we're just collecting questions. No questions? Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I thought, was it Jane's question?
Yes.
Was the idea of how, it interacts with a scientific method.
Very good.
Is a very, very good question.
Excellent.
And I think that gets to a philosophy actually of science to a certain degree.
So the question is, how does systems thinking relate to scientific method? Wonderful. Mike, what's your question?
Our discussion of the OODA loop represents the prototype of systems theory. And how do you apply, and what's the next step in applying that to decision under uncertainty and for nonlinearity and for multidimensionality? such as coming up with modern portfolio theory for managing investments, airline crew scheduling, or how to handle ending the war on poverty once and for all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to just call it, I'm going to make the simple version of it. So how does OODA loop relate to systems thinking? So we'll put that as a question. And is
uncertainty, decision under uncertainty.
Okay. Decision under uncertainty. Very good. Under uncertainty. Okay. Michael.
Yes. The question would be, is systems thinking ever a detriment to the outcome?
Okay. Is it ever a detriment? Excellent. Is it? Chad, can you speak out your question?
Yeah, I can do that. Let me see what I say. Is there any trick you can use as a tool to remember to approach a problem non-linearly? And that's just based on the fact that linear approaches are typical, and we probably are all in the habit of doing that.
Okay. Can you briefly describe for people what a non-linear approach is?
So by non-linear, basically, I really mean more non-traditional. So how can we remember when we have a problem to try to employ, these systems thinking?
Got it. Very good. Perfect. When do you apply systems thinking or non-linear approach?
Like how do you trick, how is there a certain habit or tip or trick to remind yourself, because we face these problems subconsciously all the time?
Got it. Excellent.
I guess. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Anybody else wants to put any questions on the table before we start answering the questions? Marisa.
How do you know that, or not know, that's the wrong word. What I'm thinking of, how do you formulate a mess so that you can solve it? So one can't tackle an issue or a problem until we have a certain amount of details. How do we know we're there? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does.
Can you go ahead and repeat the question? I want to make sure I got it.
So Ackoff, he tells us that, when he's telling us that it's by design that you're going to get to the problem solving, it brings up the question of how do you formulate a problem?
Okay, how do you formulate a problem? How do you know?
How do you know boundaries? Essentially,
Okay. Maybe that's what it is. Like, because you need details before you can dive into.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Limits of the problem. Okay, perfect. Ron, you had a question.
Yeah, Joe, can you explain in systems thinking the difference between a simple problem versus a complex problem?
Okay, wonderful. So we'll put that as a question for anybody who wants to answer it. Simple versus complex. What's the difference between simple versus complex problem? Okay. Anybody else? Okay, let's start with it. I'm going to keep the definition for later on. So let's start with, okay, Laura, you had a question. Laura.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, if you take like a really big problem, let's say like our educational system, that's really been fixed by putting Band-Aids over every other problem. How, when you start to rip off the Band-Aid, do you deal with the avalanche of all these problems falling down upon you, and that you really need to basically toss them all away, but you can't, and you need to reevaluate them. How do you begin to fix that mess before you can start anew?
Oh, that's excellent question. Wonderful. Let's go ahead and, all right. Okay, Joe, these are fantastic questions. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go one by one, and we will go ahead and try to try to answer. So how does, so let me just list all the questions and then we'll, I'm figuring out the order. We just want to recap all the questions. So one is, what is the definition of a system? What is a system? Next one is, how does systems thinking relate to the scientific method? Next one is, how do you make decisions under uncertainty? Or what is the connection between the OODA loop and systems thinking? Is it ever detrimental to use systems thinking? What kind of tips can you, tricks you can use to remind yourself to use systems thinking instead of a set solution that you have? How do you formulate a problem? How do you identify the limits of the problem? What's the difference between a simple versus a complex problem? How do you handle a system which is full of bandages? And actually, let's start with this because this is a very complex, very interesting question. And I think it goes to the heart of the systems thinking. So the question is, there are lots of systems out there, a lot of things out there which are put together with all kinds of bandages, bandages on the top of bandages. Now, if you want to solve that, all kinds of things are going to come loose because there are so many things that are operating in so many different directions. And how do you actually try to come up with, make a system out of this, an integrated system out of this, when it is actually put together with all these bandages? This is a monstrosity of a system. How do you handle all the problems that come with thinking of it in a systems thinking? So that's the question. So now all the answers, this is the lightning round. For you to give a short answer, you have to give an answer like 1 to 5 sentences, something like that. Try to be short. I'll be a little bit, Mike, go ahead. What's your short answer to the question?
Short answer, there's a discipline called multi-criteria objective function under constraints, where you, for example, the airline crew assignment problem is one that you got to get. You can't let these pilots run a certain amount, more than a certain amount of hours. You got to get them back to where they came from. And you got a whole list of criteria, and you got to get people that are trained on the particular aircrafts that have to go. So there's a discipline called multi-criteria objective function under constraint and uncertainty.
Okay, thank you.
There's mathematical techniques for handling that.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Next up is Joe and Jade. How do you deal with a problem like that? And how do you deal with the fallout that comes when you're trying to solve something that is put together with all of that stuff? So Joe followed by Jade. Joe.
I mean, I think part of it is the idea that you start with the ideal, but you also have to understand and deconstruct whatever, I'll take off all the band-aids and see what it looks like, see what the problem actually is. But the difficulty comes in putting it back together. When you're talking about an organizational structure, there are so many things that go into it that are, the human dynamics of it, that it becomes a lot different than what you define as optimal. So that's the way I would look at it, is blowing it up, but also looking at the political realities of being able to actually implement a solution. If you're talking about something along the lines of, we were discussing a very interesting problem in our breakout room, and I don't want to go on too long, but how would it work with improving police in communities? And it was a very interesting conversation, or was going down that route. A lot of band-aids around that. You could blow it up and define the optimal, but then you have to understand what the political dynamics are as well.
Thank you. Next up is Jade, followed by Kevin.
I think one of the important things to do is to set a clear objective to decide initially what this thing is for. Because if we don't know what something is for, how can we determine how it's supposed to function? I think it's, and then in terms of like a lot of Band-Aids, I think this is where your statement about dissolving something comes in. You don't want to just completely dismantle something, or, you know, you do things in phases. You do things where you're addressing all, and that systems thinking, understanding all the things that are going to fall apart and come together. And when you streamline all of that, when you have that going in tandem, things don't fall apart. Things actually come together. And it's the last thing I'll say is, like, again, that's strategic, to phase out a little bit, to make sure people are healing, to make sure people are fortified. I don't know, but that objective to me is the main thing. And it has to be a universal objective. Like, everyone has to be clear, this is what we're going to do. Because people are going to start ripping off Band-Aids and you're like, no. Remember, this is what we're doing.
Wonderful. I think that's great. You know, it's basically, you know the why. And that's kind of the starting point. You know, what's the function of this? And that serves as a...
Do we know what the function of education is?
Yep, that's exactly excellent. Kevin.
Peel the onion to find a root cause.
Okay, thank you. Let's go into the next question, which is connected with this, and that is, how do you formulate a problem? How do you define the limits of the problem? How do you characterize a problem? How do you know that you have actually done enough work to specify the problem? Any answers? These are complex questions, so you can take between 1 to 10 sentences. Jade.
I'm probably going to oversimplify, so people probably aren't going to like my answer, but you have a problem if someone says you have a problem. Now, is that a problem that you need to deal with? It's up to debate. But if someone says there's a problem, there's a problem.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up, Chad or Andrew, you've unmuted, so I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. I think a good way to define the problem is just to ask, what do you want? So, for example, that elevator issue. Basically, there's one question: how do we make people's how do you make them perceive their elevator wait time experience, you know, less than whatever it is? Basically, it's not like you can't just say like what's wrong with this. It's just say, first say like what do you actually want to happen?
Wonderful, excellent. So next up is going to be Chad, followed by Mike, Joe, and Kevin. Chad.
So I would say, like, the problem typically is inhibiting something. And so if you determine what you could alleviate that would allow you to access or, you know, act in a certain way that was inhibited before, then that takes care of the problem.
Thank you. Next up is Mike, Joe, Kevin, and Laura. Mike, less than 10 sentences, please. Mike, you're still on mute.
There are two kinds of systems defined. One of them is so-called over-defined systems, and the other is under-defined systems. And in some cases, and also added to that, it's uncertainty. Added to that are boundary value conditions. An over-defined system is where you have 5 unknowns and 25 equations. If you have 2 equations and 2 unknowns, you learn how to solve that in 5th grade. But in these kind of problems in system theory that Ackoff and others played with, you might either have 25 equations and 5 unknowns, and you essentially define a surface of alternate solutions that intersects. The other case of more unknowns than you have equations are things like the climate change thing. There's a whole lot of things that affect it in one way or another. Not all of the variables are orthogonal. Means that that you can map them into a simpler system, so there are techniques for solving that. Ackoff started a magazine called Informs.
Thank you.
And they have meetings. It still runs. They have meetings several times a year where they discuss special cases of this problem.
Thank you. Next up is Joe, Kevin, and Laura. Joe.
So just to build a little bit on what Mike talked about is the idea of causal loops. When you finally get to the root, that you start to figure out what's the actual cause of the problem, then you can make a determination of what's its impact and why would you solve it to begin with. So is it really a problem in the first place? I mean, some problems we actually have to live with, in certain circumstances. But once you understand the cause and then what the benefits are, and then I think you can start to establish boundaries. And I think it comes back to a lot what Mike also spoke about was the idea of managing unknowns. And I think that's probably the most critical part.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Kevin, followed by Laura. Kevin.
When the outcome of system cannot satisfy the real needs, that's possible problem. Something need to prove, or maybe redefine the new solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Laura. Laura, how do you formulate a problem?
Well, I think in most situations, we have something that is going on and we have a result and we don't like it. So it's a problem. And we have, we want to look at how we can solve that problem. And of course, we don't know all the variables that have gone into the problem and why the solution has not worked. And that's really where the problem starts. And I think that, I don't know how we get to deal with that. With most people, they're not going to be interested in all the, ifs, ands, and buts, and whys, and however. So I think that, that's where you have to bring in experts, to help create what the problem was from the beginning and look at all the details that went into that and then come up with a solution, come up with a reasonable solution to the problem. And of course, you bring that simplified solution to the people, and they'll probably be satisfied with the result. But that's sort of a very simplified, view of the problem and the systems and all of that. And I don't know if I've articulated that very well, but.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Maritza, followed by Madeline. Maritza.
So Jade's response got me thinking, and I think the simplicity of it is perfect. She says, if somebody says there's a problem, there's a problem. And so that had me thinking of, how Ackoff says that a problem is an abstraction extracted from reality by analysis. So if I look at it that way, and I have this problem because somebody said it was a problem, maybe the way to frame that is by seeking what aspects go with that. Like, so if I assume that this problem is just an abstraction, maybe what I need to do is find the additional pieces and components that might help me be able to work towards looking at it from a different angle to start to try to tackle it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Madeline. Madeline, go ahead.
Yes, well, in the way of such things, as it turns out, my comment is perfectly follows Maritza's. I was thinking that we basically, when we're thinking about these things, we're toggling back and forth in our minds between abstract concepts and analysis and the concrete details of the problem. And the way I look at it is, in practical terms, is looking at problems as what are the nodes that where we could be effective, or you could call it like the pressure points or the leverage points. So what are the things that we can do either as individuals or groups or in whatever human units to have an effect on the overall problem? So sort of keeping the overall problem in mind and seeing all the nodes and the connectors between them while applying pressure to a particular node.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. The most intriguing and amazing answer I've heard to this is from Louis Sullivan. And his principle is that a problem contains its own solution. What he's saying is that most people, when they say that they have a problem, they actually don't know what the problem is. They've never really specified. They've kind of just uneasy feeling. They're saying, okay, something, they have all these kind of different things that they want and different things that they know are going on. And what he's saying is that it's the process of discovering kind of the shape and the limits of the problem. Once you've kind of defined the problem, solution just suggests itself. He says problem suggests and contains and suggests its own solution. And most of the times it's all about it. You're not really looking at the problem. You're just saying what he calls, he says most things that people see as problems are actually figments, that they have all kinds of wishes and all kinds of things that they wish were so, and it's all kind of mixed up. And it's in the process of discovering what is actually going on that you come up with that. So we have, my friend Sherry and I did a full video on that particular principle. So I would definitely recommend that. I put that in chat. All right, let's go to the next question. Let's see. Is it ever detrimental to use systems thinking? Laura is shaking her head. And let's see, anybody else has any? Joe followed by Madeline. Joe.
I think that there is one scenario, and I forget, Ron actually had brought it up. I mean, this is the distinction between a complex problem versus a simple problem. And if it's a simple problem, then you don't necessarily want to use systems thinking, where there's not a lot of definite movement parts. It's not very dynamic. It's not, there aren't a lot of variables between the solution and the answer. Whereas wicked problems that tend to be, filled with unknowns and complex in nature, that you would take a more systematic approach to try and determine what is causing, what's the causation of the problem itself, because it becomes a lot more complex and you have to look at the whole system at that point. But simple problems there are linear problems that exist in this world. And so I'd say that would be my only distinction.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Madeline, Jade, Mike, and Laura.
Yes, well, following right on to what Joe said, what I have found is that it's far too easy to overthink simple tasks and get paralyzed by abstracting them too much and seeing them as part of a larger network and problem. And sometimes it's easier to just pick a solution. If it's something very practical, like what order should I do my errands in? Just pick something and stick with it. Don't agonize. Don't sit around and agonize. Just go out and do the things, even if it's not perfect.
Thank you, Marilyn. Next up is Jade, Mike, and Laura. Jade.
I think systems thinking can be detrimental if you don't understand the system that you are trying to apply. I think even with simple problems are complex, but I think those are usually the problems where we kind of feel like not considering things is going to be more or less inconsequential. But then there are those things where even if it's a simple, something that seems on the surface simple, and the variables that you're not aware of or not taking the time to consider are actually consequential. So, you know, it's relative, but, you know, basically not understanding the system or taking something for granted can have consequences.
Mike, is systems thinking ever detrimental?
I would say no. However, that you need not make part of system thinking is don't make a simple problem complex and find an elegant Occam razor type solution. And that often requires system thinking. But don't be as complex as needed, but not more complex than needed.
Thank you. Next up is Laura, Kevin, and Chad. Laura.
I just think it's okay to have, think about simple systems also. I don't think you should negate them as, not necessary to be thought about.
Thank you. Kevin, do you think systems thinking is ever detrimental?
Yeah, I would say situation based. Sometimes emergency, yeah, you don't need to put a complicated. It's initially simple. If you put a system too much, possible got complex.
Thank you. Chad, what do you think?
I'd say it depends on how you think about it. Like if you see that a system can be simply solved by one, basic act, then you're not wasting time. But if you use it in kind of a way where you're going over something a little too much, sometimes you need to have a bias for action. And especially if I would say somebody's in kind of a lull in their life, you probably just need to take somebody who cares about you's advice. You don't really need to overanalyze something.
Thank you. Thank you, Chad. So now we're going to be talking next about decision under uncertainty and ideas of John Boyd and the OODA loop connected with systems thinking. I just want to let you know that Chet Richards, who worked with John Boyd on the OODA loop in developing the idea of OODA loop, is going to be here on Saturday. He's written a book called Certain to Win, which takes these ideas of operating with uncertainty and OODA loop and how do you apply it to business. That's what the book is about. He worked with Boyd on that book before Boyd's death for about 15 years or so. And then he published the book after that. So he will be here and I'll be interviewing him on his book. So it's a very rare opportunity to have somebody of that caliber come and talk to us. So don't miss that. And if this is going to be Saturday at 5 o'clock, and on that meetup, there is this entire playlist we have of Chuck Spinney and Chet Richards talking about John Boyd's idea. Chuck Spinney does the version of John Boyd's original presentation on OODA loop, and he actually did the presentation for us. So if you have not seen it, it's probably one of the most valuable videos that we have on our YouTube channel. So don't miss that. I'll put the playlist in the chat shortly. So the question is, how do you use systems thinking under the conditions of uncertainty? How do you make decisions under conditions of uncertainty using systems theory? Anybody? Or you can talk about what's the connection between OODA loop, which is all about doing this, and systems theory. And that's deafening silence. Anybody? Jade. Jade followed by Joe. Jade.
I'm taking a shot in the dark here, but I feel as though if there's uncertainty, then you most likely have an incomplete system. And if you have an incomplete system, then it's basically gathering those details. I think it was Maritza was talking about, you need to make sure you have enough details in order to create a system to figure it out, or you testing the system and seeing what's missing and what's in. I guess that's where the scientific part comes in. You figure out, okay, what's working, what's not working, why isn't it working, why is it working? So it's a balance between all of those things, I think, and probably a bunch of that I didn't say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jade. Next up is Joe, followed by Mike. Joe.
I mean, I'm trying to think this through. Because during the orientation phase is where I can only see the idea of that you're looking at your opponent's system and understanding, them as a way of actually understanding what course of action you should take. So it's you're kind of, you need to, but I don't know if I would use that as necessarily as systems thinking per se. I wouldn't define that in the traditional sense of systems thinking, but I would say that there is a systems element to the orientation phase of the OODA loop that exists. So it was my best shot.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Mike.
Well, most things are uncertain. We've learned in school, you learned about something called normal distributions and maybe even other kinds of distributions, Weibull and a whole list of other names. But there's another discipline called non-parametric statistics.
Mike, this is a lightning round, okay?
Lightning round.
Yes.
And so the techniques you use is you find an area where you're certain. And the OODA loop is essentially saying that the so-called small signal approach, just do a little bit and you're certain about the next step. You may, as Madeline said in one of her things, if you optimize it step by step, you may not globally optimize it because you may find yourself in a dead end. But the best you can do in that approach is to just look at the next step and the very small step. For every epsilon, you can find a delta that you are certain. And that's where you go. But that has danger. So you need to look at the big picture, and that's called global optimization. There are techniques with quantum computing to look at the whole picture.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is Maritza.
Maybe we just assume that there is a piece missing and make our peace with the fact that there's going to be a level of uncertainty and attempt despite that to go forward, but just keep that in mind. Like, I think we're doomed if we start to assume that we have all the pieces.
Thank you. I think one of the virtues of the OODA loop is that it puts action as a component of cognition. So what it is saying is that you cannot wait to develop a perfect system. That is not a good strategy. You try your best to build your system and then you act on it. And in the process of acting, you are, when you act, be observant about what is it, the dog that did not bark, unexpected results of what happened, what went wrong, and use that in observation to reformulate the system. That's the orientation phase. And then use that to act again. So there is this back and forth action So it's a question of, so it's not, systems are not developed kind of in isolation from life. They are built as, you know, as a living process. And I find that to be kind of critical way of, you know, working with systems. So, you know, because I don't see any other way of making sure that they actually correspond to reality. Because if they are corresponding to reality, it will produce certain effects. And no matter how much you think, we are all subject to all kinds of biases. So if you kind of try to do a lot of work just inside without interacting with the world, at every step, it is likely to go away from what is actually going on because of the nature of biases. But so you need kind of an open system of thought where you are continuously going back and forth with the world. Joe, followed by Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually captures it really well. I mean, I would just like to note that one of the things that is in the orientation phase is the idea of like cultural traditions that they keep in mind, and things like genetic heritage and how to incorporate new information as well. So these are system thinking concepts that fit in the orientation phase, that are, you know, that there are elements of it, but I don't know if I would call it traditional systems thinking in the way we were using it this evening.
Right, very good. And the point is that there is a lot of ground. I mean, another thing that OODA loop is always conscious of is that there is ground, that there is a lot of things that you are not aware of. And you better be on the watch out for those things and to try to kind of integrate that into your system. Next up is Kevin.
Yeah, for me, it's after before all the loop, the first you need to define the right system, set the direction, that's you go. You don't put a long way, you never take time to come back. Then that's the steps, right? Then to act on it, like you said, then all the loop comes to play.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Laura, what do you think about acting in the face of uncertainty and its connection with systems thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to have that. You have to have those pieces that you know, and you work on those. And there's always going to be some uncertainty within that, what you know, and you have to loop, you know, you add that in. And when you do that, something's going to change and there's going to be more unknowns that you get from that. You keep on going. And it's the only way I can see it. So if you want to add, like, you know, I know C1 and C2, and then there's this delta or whatever it is that you have tagging on, but that's going to be all the unknowns that you don't know. And you know some of them, but you're not quite certain where they, some of them you know you don't know, but whatever, it's that feeling that you have. But it's an iterative process, that's all. And you hope to make that go down to 0 at some point where eventually you know them all, or most of them.
Thank you. All right, let's go to the next question. So the question is, how does systems thinking relate to the scientific method? Is there a conflict between systems thinking and scientific method, or is it the same? So Jane, would you like to elaborate on the question further, or have I captured it well enough? Okay, anybody who wants to answer the question, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Chad.
So I think that when we talked about another question, which was, what is the problem? How do you define a problem? I think you can almost take a scientific method approach within systems thinking and hypothesize what the problem is. So that's a little inception there. But
okay, thank you, Chad. Next up is Madeline, followed by Mike. Madeline.
Yes. I don't see that there's any contradiction. I see that, say, for example, Kuhn's idea of paradigm change and how inconsistencies accumulate around a theory that everyone's working with until they overwhelm that theory. To use a concrete example of systems thinking in science, there's a biological oceanographer, Penny Chisholm. She's at MIT. Back in the 80s, I believe, basically in science, oceans are a big carbon sink. The phytoplankton, the little green things that take up the carbon, the amount in the ocean didn't account for how much of a carbon sink the ocean was. So this woman went out there and actually looked at things in detail as a scientist, dragged nets through the waters, and discovered that there were many, many little photosynthesizers that were much tinier than normal phytoplankton. They're like the size, almost as small as viruses. And those accounted for the difference in the total amount of the carbon sink. And she is now, with these proposals to like seed the oceans with nutrients, to accelerate plankton growth, to make the oceans a bigger carbon sink. She's one of the people who's most opposed to that and most outspoken against that, because she can see that there are so many unforeseen consequences to that, that it's not worth doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Madeline, this is lightning round. So let's try to keep the example shorter. I love the example. Okay, I love the example. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep things short so we can cover as many different things as possible. Thank you. Next up is Mike, followed by Kevin. Mike.
Well, speaking of keeping it short, the Kuhn's falsification is even appropriate to determine whether your hypothesis is valid. And so the scientific method is system thinking.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great point. Kevin.
Yeah, I'll put another way around. I would say system thinking is one of method of scientific method. Then for hypothesis experimentation, say they both use it. It's hard to change. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. So folks, I think this format is working really well. So Joe and I are going to do a series of meetups on Tuesdays with this format. We're going to experiment. We're going to take topics. Again, I'm happy to get any suggestions from you on topics. What we want is we want topics that we have discussed before or similar to what we have discussed before that we can build on, because the greater the common knowledge that we have. So because we've done many meetups directly on systems thinking and many meetups connected with it. We've looked at Buckminster Fuller, we've looked at Louis Sullivan, we have looked at many things. So it helps. All of that kind of makes the conversation rich. So if you have any suggestions, you can write to me at 52livingideas@gmail.com or send me a message on Meetup. So Joe, I thought this went very well. The amount of engagement, amount of range of things. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I did too. I think that we really actually had some good discussions in particularly our breakout room. But I really liked the questions. And I thought the questions were very, very good and enough to take away where I'm walking away with more questions for myself. So I really enjoyed the lightning round more than anything.
Wonderful. So folks, I want to run a poll to just so that you can give us feedback on what we did right and what we did wrong. So just go ahead and fill it out. It takes only a couple of minutes to do that. So first one is you can choose in the first question, which part of the meetups did you enjoy today? And you can choose multiple ones in that one. And then you can evaluate the meetup overall. Joe, you won't be able to vote, I think, because you're a co-host. And that would be cheating. But folks, just and let us know which part of the meetup, evaluate each part of the meetup, the beginning part, the breakout rooms, and the lightning round. And as soon as we're done, we're going to share the results. So all of us will get to see what all of us think about what we are doing. Okay, so 7 people have voted, please, I'm going to give another maybe few seconds, up to 9 out of 17. Do I hear a 10? Not yet. Okay, you got only, I'm going to hit the gavel now. All right, let me go ahead and hit the gavel. We got 10. Oh, I got 10. Okay, so we'll start with 10 and let's see what, if you're about to hit send, go ahead and send that. Okay, I'm starting the poll and poll share results. Okay, so everybody likes, 80% of the people like the takeaways. So that's a thing. Let's see, overall it was excellent, 70% excellent. How was the presentation? Joe, your presentation was excellent to good. 60-40, that's very good. Breakout rooms worked out well, and everybody likes the takeaways and questions. Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much, folks.